Hi friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. In this session, we are going to talk about an international standard ISO 37001 2016. Now, we shall start discussing the clause 8 operation of ISO 37001 2016. The clause 8 of ISO 37001 2016 covers about the planning and control of ISO 37001 and covers due diligence, financial controls and non-financial controls. This clause is designed to help an organization establish, implement, maintain and improve an anti-bribery compliance program. The Clause 8 includes a series of measures and controls that represent global anti-bribery good practice. The standard is flexible and can be adapted to a wide range of organizations, including large organizations, small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, public and private sector organizations, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, etc. The Clause 8 operation of ISO 37001 2016 has 10 subclauses, which are 8.1 Operational Planning and Control, 8.2 Due Diligence, 8.3 Financial Controls, 8.4 Non-Financial Controls, 8.5 Implementation of Anti-Bribery Controls by Controlled Organizations and by Business Associates, 8.6 Anti-Bribery Commitments, 8.7 Gifts, Hospitality, Donations and Similar Benefits, 8.8 Managing Inadequacy of Anti-Bribery Controls, 8.9 Raising Concerns, 8.10 Investigating and Dealing with Bribery. Let me start with subclause 8.1 Operational Planning and Control. The subclause 8.1 Operational Planning and Control of ISO 37001 2016 states that the organization must plan, implement, review, and control the processes needed to meet requirements of the anti-bribery management system and to implement the actions determined in the subclause 6.1 by establishing criteria for the processes, implementing control of the processes in accordance with the criteria, and keeping documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as planned. Clause 8.1 says that these processes must include the specific controls referred to in subclause 8.2 to 8.10 of the standard. Subclause 8.1 specifies that the organization must control planned changes and review the consequences of unintended changes, taking action to mitigate any adverse effects as necessary. The organization must also ensure that outsourced processes are controlled. This subclause 8.1 mentions under a note that the core text of ISO management system standards contains a requirement in relation to outsourcing, which is not used in this document, and outsourcing providers are included within the definition of business associate. Coming to the subclause 8.2, due diligence. The subclause 8.2 of ISO 37001 2016 states that where the organization's bribery risk assessment, as conducted in subclause 4.5, has assessed a more than low bribery risk in relation to specific categories of transactions, projects, or activities, planned or ongoing relationships with specific categories of business associates, or specific categories of personnel in certain positions. It is mentioned here in clause 8.2 to refer to subclause 7.2.2.2 for more information. This subclause 8.2, due diligence, specifies that the organization must assess the nature and extent of the bribery risk in relation to specific transactions, projects, activities, business associates, and personnel falling within those categories. This assessment must include any due diligence necessary to obtain sufficient information to assess the bribery risk. The due diligence must be updated at a defined frequency so that changes and new information can be properly taken into account. It is mentioned as Note 1 under Subclause 8.2 that the organization can include that it is unnecessary, unreasonable, or disproportionate to undertake due diligence on certain categories of personnel and business associates. The clause 8.2 stresses on Note 2 that the factors listed in A, B, and C above are not exhaustive. At the end of subclause 8.2, the standard recommends under Note 3 to refer annexure A.10 for further guidance. Let's have a discussion of subclause 8.3 financial controls of ISO 37001-2016. The subclause 8.3 financial control simply states that the organization must implement financial controls that manage bribery risk. It is also recommended under subclause 8.3 as a note to refer to the annexure A.11 for more guidance. Let's talk about subclause 8.4, non-financial controls. The subclause 8.4 specifies that the organization must implement non-financial controls that manage bribery risk with respect to such areas as procurement, operational, sales, commercial, human resources, legal, and regulatory activities. This clause states under Note 1 that any particular transaction, activity, or relationship can be subject to financial as well as non-financial controls. Under Note 2, it has been recommended to refer to annexure A.12 for guidance. Coming to the subclause 8.5, implementation of anti-bribery controls by controlled organizations and by business associates. Subclause 8.5.1 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must implement procedures which require that all other organizations over which it has control either implement the organization's anti-bribery management system or implement their own anti-bribery controls. In each case, only to the extent that is reasonable and proportionate with regards to the bribery risks faced by the controlled organizations, taking into account the bribery risk assessment conducted in accordance with subclause 4.5 of the standard. Subclause 8.5.1 under a note states that an organization has control over another organization if it directly or indirectly controls the management of the organization. Under this subclause 8.5.1, it is also recommended to refer annexure A.13.1.3. Now, let me discuss the subclause 8.5.2. This clause says that in relation to business associates not controlled by the organization for which the bribery risk assessment or due diligence has identified a more than low bribery risk and where anti-bribery controls implemented by the business associates would help mitigate the relevant bribery risk. The organization must implement some procedures which I am explaining to you now. The organization must determine whether the business associate has in place anti-bribery controls which manage the relevant bribery risk. Where a business associate does not have in place anti-bribery controls or it is not possible to verify whether it has them in place. Where practicable, the organization must require the business associate to implement anti-bribery controls in relation to the relevant transaction, project, or activity. Or where it is not practicable, to require the business associate to implement anti-bribery controls. This must be a factor taken into account in evaluating the bribery risk of the relationship with this business associate and the way in which the organization manages such risks. The subclause 8.5.2 also states as a note to refer to annexure A.13 for guidance. Let us now talk about subclause 8.6, anti-bribery commitments, where business associates are with more than acceptable or low bribery risk. Effective controls and decisions are required, and it may lead to termination of the relationship. Bribery risk assessment is necessary for such situations for evaluating the risk to the organization. Subclause 8.6a says that for business associates which pose more than a low bribery risk, the organization must implement procedures which require that, as far as practicable, business associates commit to preventing bribery by, on behalf of, or for the benefit of the business associate in connection with the relevant transaction, project, activity, or relationship. According to Clause 8.6b, as far as practicable, the organization must also implement procedures which require that the organization is able to terminate the relationship with the business associate in the event of bribery by, on behalf of, or for the benefit of the business associate in connection with the relevant transaction, project, activity, or relationship. This clause specifies that where it is not practicable to meet the requirements of 8.6a or 8.6b here, this must be a factor taken into account in evaluating the bribery risk of the relationship with this business associate and the way in which the organization manages such risks. Clause 8.6 also recommends referring annexure A.14 of the standard for further guidance. Coming to subclause 8.7, gifts, hospitality, donations, and similar benefits. This clause 8.7 states that the organization must implement procedures that are designed to prevent the offering, provision, or acceptance of gifts, hospitality, donations, and similar benefits where the offering, provision, or acceptance is bribery or could reasonably be perceived as bribery. Referring to annexure A.15 of the standard, it is also recommended as a note under this subclause 8.7 of ISO 37001-2016. Let's talk about subclause 8.8 of ISO 37001-2016, that is, managing inadequacy of anti-bribery controls. This clause 8.8 states that where the organization cannot manage bribery risk, the relationship or project or contract is to be reviewed at appropriate stages. It can also be withdrawn or declined as feasible. Subclause 8.8 says that where the due diligence conducted on a specific transaction, project, activity, or relationship with a business associate establishes that the bribery risks cannot be managed by existing anti-bribery controls, organization must take steps appropriate to the bribery risks and the nature of the transaction, project, activity, or relationship to terminate, discontinue, suspend, or withdraw from it as soon as practicable. In the case of an existing transaction, project, activity, or relationship. If the organization cannot or does not wish to implement additional or enhanced anti-bribery controls or take other appropriate steps to enable the organization to manage the relevant bribery risks, the organization must postpone or decline to continue with it in the case of a proposed new transaction, project, activity, or relationship. Examples of appropriate steps are such as changing the nature of the transaction, project, activity, or relationship, etc. Coming to subclause 8.9, raising concerns. The subclause 8.9a states that the organization must implement procedures which encourage and enable persons to report in good faith or on the basis of a reasonable belief attempted, suspected, and actual bribery or any violation of or weakness in the anti-bribery management system to the anti-bribery compliance function or to appropriate personnel. As per clause, it could be either directly or through an appropriate third party. Subclause 8.9b states that the organization must implement procedures except to the extent required to progress an investigation, require that the organization treats reports confidentially so as to protect the identity of the reporter and of others involved or referenced in the report. Subclause 8.9c says that procedure must allow anonymous reporting and, as per the subclause 8.9d, it prohibits retaliation and protect those making reports from retaliation after they have in good faith or on the basis of a reasonable belief raised or reported a concern about attempted, actual, or suspected bribery or violation of the anti-bribery policy or the anti-bribery management system. Subclause 8.9e states that it must enable personnel to receive advice from an appropriate person on what to do if faced with a concern or situation which could involve bribery. Clause 8.9 also specifies that the organization must ensure that all personnel are aware of the reporting procedures and are able to use them, and are aware of their rights and protections under the procedures. Under Note 1, clause states that the procedures can be the same as or form part of those used for the reporting of other issues of concern. The examples of concerns are safety, malpractice, wrongdoing, or other serious risk, etc. Under Note 2, clause says that the organization can use a business associate to manage the reporting system on its behalf. And under Note 3, it has been stated by the clause 8.9 that in some jurisdictions, the requirements in 8.9b and 8.9c are prohibited by law. In these cases, the organization documents its inability to comply. Let's talk about the subclause 8.10, investigating and dealing with bribery. This subclause 8.10 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must implement procedures that require assessment and, where appropriate, investigation of any bribery or violation of the anti-bribery policy or the anti-bribery management system, which is reported, detected, or reasonably suspected. As per this clause, the organization must implement procedures that require appropriate action in the event that the investigation reveals any bribery or violation of the anti-bribery policy or the anti-bribery management system. According to the subclause 8.10, the procedures require empowering and enabling investigators and require cooperation in the investigation by relevant personnel. The clause also says that organization must implement procedures that require that the status and the results of the investigation are reported to the anti-bribery compliance function and other compliance functions as appropriate. The procedures also require that the investigation is carried out confidentially and that the outputs of the investigation are confidential. As per clause 8.10, the investigation must be carried out by and reported to personnel who are not part of the role or function being investigated. The organization can appoint a business associate to conduct the investigation and report the results to personnel who are not part of the role or function being investigated. Finally, it is recommended under Note 1 to refer Annexure A.18 for additional guidance. And under Note 2, clause also says that in some jurisdictions, the requirement in 8.10f is prohibited by law. In this case, the organization documents its inability to comply. Friends, it was all about Clause 8 till now, operation of ISO 37001 2016. I sincerely thank you for all your interest and attention. Thanks and best wishes.